So, new set equals new cards, which equals deck upgrades, or potentially some new strategies that we could try out in Commander. So, let's see what kind of goodies we get from Zendikar Rising. What is up, Commander players? My name is Matt, and you're watching Top Commanders. So, we've already taken a look at the new commanders coming from Zendikar Rising, but it's time to take a look at some of the cards that we can use in the 99 to make some reasonable upgrades or potentially bring about new strategies in the game. Who knows? We'll have to see what we get in this set. But before I get into that, if you wish to support this channel, be sure to like, share, and subscribe as always. And if you want to support this channel directly, be sure to visit patreon.com/topcommander. But with that out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about a few things. First off, for those of you wondering what happened to the episode for Monday, the easy explanation for that was Sunday happened to be my girlfriend's birthday. So, spent the day with her for her birthday, made dinner and everything. Didn't actually record an episode for Monday, so I do apologize about that. Some things like that will pop up in the future, potentially, so I will always let you guys know what happened and why I didn't get those episodes out to you guys, but there will be one coming this coming Monday. I promise. We will be sticking to the schedule, unless, of course, birthdays, holidays, stuff like that will vary the schedule slightly. So I will update you guys as we move forward. But let's go ahead and get right into the cards that we can use in the 99 from Zendikar Rising. Starting with Angel of Destiny. Happens to be 3 generic and 2 white, so 5 mana for a 2/6 creature angel cleric. Has flying and double strike. Not bad for 5 mana. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you and that player each gain that much life. At the beginning of your end step, if you have at least 15 life more than your starting life total, each player Angel of Destiny attack this turn loses the game. Okay, so this is actually a really interesting card, which Mark Rosewater did send out a tweet prior to spoilers that there was going to be a new white card with a win con on it, basically, which I'm guessing this would be it. This is a very odd read. So, whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, so any of your creatures deals damage, you gain that much life, and that player each gains that much life. So, the hard read on this is basically your opponent's not losing any life. They take the combat damage, but then they gain that much life back. Now, Angel of Destiny reads that you also gain the amount of life equal to the damage that all of your creatures are dealing. And then at the beginning of your end step, if you have at least 15 or life more than your starting life total, so if you're at least at 55, because in Commander we start at 40, each player Angel of Destiny attacked this turn loses the game. So Angel of Destiny has to attack something. Now, that can be a little tricky because your opponent's more than likely not going to let that connect. I could see maybe some form of a life gain deck with white in it, obviously, to be able to run this. That maybe a go wide token strategy, and then you can hit all of your opponents. Your opponents take the combat damage, but then they gain that much life back. So I'm not sure how the rules interaction works if you can swing for lethal. That'd be a ruling that we would have to check into a little bit deeper. But then, if Angel of Destiny didn't attack anybody You don't get the last part of this. And it only KOs one person at a time. However, the cool thing is this is not a legendary. So dropping in Angel of Destiny, and if you manage to get something like Swiftfoot Boots or some sort of haste enabler on it, and can potentially clone it, or Blade of Selves would not be a bad idea either, because you get the myriad effect to get the tokens and they attack each opponent. So you could do that, and if you can manage to get your life at 55 or higher, you KO everybody with a Blade of Selves and Angel of Destiny. This is a very interesting card. It reads very odd, but I like it to an extent. This is definitely something that I feel like you'll see at way more casual commander tables, because the more competitive you go, this is not going to be a viable option, as far as I can tell. I would talk with a few CEDH players just to double check, but I don't see this being too much of a viable option. Next up, we have Archon of Ameria. This one, however, CDH players are in love with. 2 generic and a white for a 2/3 creature. Archon has flying. Each player can't cast more than one spell each turn. We're already off to the races. Non-basic lands your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. We're definitely off to the races. So this is more of a Staxy control piece. Basically slows down your opponents a lot. I don't think there's much that needs to be said about this. A lot of their lands are coming into play tapped, and they're stuck playing one card a turn. Hopefully you're running something like Leyline of Anticipation, Vidalcan Ori, or just have a lot of instants. This one is going to hurt. But if you get it off the field, which, I mean, it doesn't have hexproof, it doesn't have indestructible, it doesn't have shroud, it's just a 2/3 flyer other than that. It still can be annoying, trust me, but it will definitely slow you down for a little while. Next up, Fischl Retreat. I love this card. 3 generic and a white for an enchantment. And it has Landfall. Landfall is the mechanic that basically comes from Zendikar. Triggers whenever a land enters the battlefield. Very self-explanatory. So whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, choose one. Create a 2/2 white cat beast creature token, or put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Those creatures gain vigilance until end of turn. So it's a new retreat that with a landfall that gives you tokens, or it can buff up your team. I really like this one, and a lot of people are forgetting the part that yes, it's a white card, but there are landfall decks for white. Karametra, God of the Harvest. Her triggered ability is every time you cast a creature, you can search your deck for a forest or plains and put it into the battlefield tapped. There's Chulane, Teller of Tales, where every time you cast a creature, you draw a card and can put a land into play. So decks like that, the new 4-color Omnath, or even the 3-color Omnath, I believe, also had white. Actually, no, he was Teamer. So the 4-color Omnath added white, so he could potentially use this. There is a new landfall deck that is in Naya, that is the commander style precon that's coming with Zendikar Rising set. So there's white landfall decks out there. Or if you're just in white, you can just use a Crucible of Worlds and put in a couple of fetch lands, even Terramorphic Expanse, Evolving Wilds, play it, sack it, get a land. There's 2 landfall triggers right there. Sword of the Animist is an artifact equipment. Whenever the equipped creature attacks, put a basic land out of your deck into play tapped. There's ways to get landfall triggers in white, even if you're in mono white. So if you're looking to try to take advantage of this can happen. But overall, I feel like it's a really great card. Next up, we have Skyclave Apparition. 1 generic, 2 white for a 2/2 creature core spirit. When Skyclave Apparition enters the battlefield, exile up to 1 target non-land, non-token permanent you don't control with CMC 4 or less. That's a mouthful. When Skyclave Apparition leaves the battlefield, the exiled card's owner creates an XX blue illusion creature token where X is the CMC of the exiled card. Now, think about... So this is removal on a creature on ETB, and it's whenever he leaves the battlefield, so you can blink it and hit another target, and they'll get a token. But now, is the restriction of 4 or less on the CMC that big of a deal? Not really. That hits Ristic Study, Panharmonicon, Aetherflux Reservoir. That hits, because it's non-token, non-land permanent, so you can hit a bunch of artifacts, a lot of enchantments. And the price of this leaving the battlefield, it's not like Oblivion Ring or something, or any of the enchantments that exile as a non-token permanent, and then when the enchantment leaves, they get it back. This one just gives them a token, so it stays gone. So this is actually really good. I would be careful about blinking in a whole bunch, though, especially if you're targeting one person, because you don't want to eventually give them a whole army of tokens to swing out at you, unless you have a way to deal with that. Alright, next up. Confounding Conundrum. 1 generic and a blue for an enchantment. Whenever it enters the battlefield, draw a card. So it's a 2 mana enchantment that cantrips. Cool. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, if that player had another land enter the battlefield under their control this turn, they return a land they control to its owner's hand. So I kind of like how this reads, because we all have seen people run green and the green land ramp to a really heavy extent. I'm talking explosive vegetation, Skyshroud Claim. If they hit their land drops, they're using Oracle of Moldiah to drop more lands into play. The lands matter decks, this punishes lands matters, definitely. Because now they get their 1 land for turn, cool. Now they play a Farseek. Okay, well, land there in the battlefield. You've already played your land for turn. Now you have to bounce one. They're not ramping now. They're just spinning wheels. So this one can hurt them. Of course, I mean, it could also help them in a weird way, because they are a lands matter deck. So they have ways, of course, to take advantage of lands being bounced to their hand too, because they have cards that give them all these extra land drops for a reason. Next up, so this is just a common card, but I really, really like this one. It's Deliberate. 1 generic and a blue for an instant. Scry 2, then draw a card. Sound familiar? Ponder, Preordain, Brainstorm, Serum Visions. There's a bunch of, like, blue cantrips that a lot of people will use, and some of them that people use is not correct. Brainstorm doesn't go in every deck, in my opinion. Just because you have blue does not mean Brainstorm goes in it. Now, Ponder and Preordain, I definitely agree with those, because you get to sift through the top and then draw a card. You can scry, You can shuffle with both of those. Brainstorm, you draw 3, put 2 back, and you're stuck with those unless you have something to shuffle. A tutor, a fetch land, anything. Deliberate, I feel, is a little bit better than Brainstorm because you get to scry 2 and then draw a card. Now, I'm not saying that Brainstorm is bad. I'm not saying that there are decks, that there's not a deck out there that needs Brainstorm. I'm saying Deliberate probably needs to be run more often than Brainstorm. But it's also a common card. This is going to be like a 10-cent card. Very easily. Maybe 5 cents. Next up, Glasspool Mimic. 2 generic and a blue for a 0/0 creature shapeshifter rogue. You may have Glasspool Mimic enter the battlefield as a copy of a creature you control, except it's a shapeshifter rogue in addition to its other types. I like this one because it's a clone effect, yes, but it only clones your creatures. Now, is that good? Now, typically the purpose of having a clone is to be able to clone what your opponents are doing. This one only copies what you're doing. So, it's kind of 50-50, but there are instances where I feel like this is correct to run. You can copy Mana Dorks. You can copy a big creature like Noxious Gearhulk or Sun Titan, because those are not legendary. So you can get extra copies of stuff like that. Or even Reclamation Sage. Like, there's options to be able to do that in certain decks. But this is also one of the new cards that have a flip on it. Now, the flip on it is called Glasspool Shore, and it's a land that enters battlefield tapped and can tap and add a blue. Now, the way that these work, apparently, the front side of the card is Glasspool Mimic. The back side of the card is the land. You get to choose how you're using this card. If you open with this and you don't have any other land drops, you can flip it over and say, this is my land for turn, and it's Glasspool Shore. These are not bad cards. I kind of like the weird flip thing going on with the backside of the card being a land, because when at first it doesn't look like you have a lot of lands, if you open with one of these flip cards, you can potentially still have a land drop, which is kind of neat, kind of interesting to see them doing something like this. They've done flip cards before, but I don't think they've never done anything like this where you choose which side you're using necessarily. Usually you have to have some sort of condition met to be able to flip it. These ones you just choose as you're playing them from your hand if you're going to cast the Glasspool Mimic or if you're going to put the land into play tapped. It seems a bit confusing, and there's apparently some rulings where there are corner cases for these. I haven't looked into them extensively yet, haven't had the opportunity to, haven't had the time with the work schedule and everything, but I'm sure somebody out there probably has already released a video on this. I'll have to look into that. But moving on, Inscription of Insight. 3 generic and a blue for a sorcery. Choose one. If this spell was kicked, choose any number instead, and the kicker cost is 2 generic and 2 blue. So, for 5 generic and 3 blue, 8 mana, you can choose all 3. Return up to 2 target creatures to their owner's hands. Scry 2, then draw 2. Target player creates an XX illusion creature token where X is the number of cards in their hand. So, let's talk about this. 1, it's a sorcery. Not really going crazy over it being a sorcery. If this was an instant, I feel like this would be better. But then there's also the fact of the kicker cost being 8 mana. So 8 mana, you can bounce 2 creatures, scry 2, draw 2, and then you can create an XX illusion where X is the number of cards in your hand. 8 mana is one off from being Expropriate. Expropriate can win games. Cyclonic Rift can potentially win games if you have a board state, of course. That's 7 mana if you overload it. This I don't feel is doing enough for 8 mana to be justified. And with it not even being an instant, it's not doing enough at all. At casual tables, this is fine. But me personally, I don't feel like this card is quite getting there as far as value. For 8 mana, there's way better things to be doing. I like the artwork on these. There's a couple of inscriptions. They don't have them for all 5 colors. It's just the green, black, and blue one. But I'll talk about some of the others. Maybe one of the other ones are better. We'll see. Next up, we have the new Jace, and I really like the artwork on this. Jace, Mirror Mage, 1 generic and 2 blue for a legendary planeswalker. Jace starts off with 4 loyalty, and he has Kicker 2. Planeswalker with Kicker. This ought to be good. When Jace enters the battlefield, if Jace was kicked, create a token that's a copy of Jace Mirror Mage, except it's not legendary and its starting loyalty is 0. Okay, so for 5 mana you get 2 Jaces, and each of them can use their loyalty abilities separately. Okay. +1 you can scry 2, or 0, draw a card, reveal it, remove a number of loyalty counters equal to that card's CMC from Jace Mirror Mage. Okay. So, I'm not sure exactly what they were going for. So you pay 5 mana, you get Jace, and the token copy. Now, the token copy only comes with 1 loyalty. Jace comes in with 4. So I guess if your mana curve in your deck is low enough, you can manipulate it in a weird way. So you +1 the token copy, and then use the original to 0 and draw a card, and then he takes damage, maybe. And then on your next turn, you plus the original, because you want to keep the original on the field, and then use the 0 for the token. Or you just use the token's 0 as fodder on the first go. Interesting. We've never seen Kicker on a Planeswalker before, but we did have that Nissa with the X in the mana cost, so they're trying new things with the Planeswalkers. I'm not sure. This one just seems fine in Commander. It's not the best. I definitely like the art, but moving on. Maddening cacophony? I'm not sure how you pronounce that one. 1 generic and a blue for a sorcery, has Kicker, which costs 3 and a blue. So if you kick the spell, it's 4 generic and 2 blue, so 6 mana. Each opponent mills 8 cards. Okay. If the spell was kicked, instead, each opponent mills half their library rounded up. There it is. I'm not sure if there's another card that can go with this that just makes them mill their entire deck. Beyond, like, I believe Bruvac says whenever an opponent mills... whenever your opponent mills cards, they mill double that amount of cards. So with Bruvac, Maddening Cacophony would be an instant win. Unless they have an odd number, I guess. Because if you have to round, I think they end up with 1 card in deck. That's going to be interesting. No. Because if you round up, yeah, I'm pretty sure that would just kill everybody at the table. Next up, we have Seagate Stormcaller. 1 generic and a blue for a 2/1 human wizard. Has kicker 4 and a blue. So for 5 generic and 2 blue, 7 mana, you get the kicked ability. When Seagate Stormcaller enters the battlefield, copy the next instant or sorcery spell with CMC 2 or less. You cast this turn when you cast it. If Seagate Stormcaller was kicked, copy that spell twice instead. You may choose new targets for the copies. So this is going to be basically a storm card. It's copying a spell on a creature. So here's the hard thing, right? We have a lot of copy spell abilities. There's a lot of ways to go infinite with that. There's ways to storm off with that and kill somebody with a grape shot, I believe is what it is. I'm not sure if those decks are going to be running Seagate Stormcaller because they have so many of these cards as it is. That being said, with it being only 2 mana is the reason why I put it on here, because of the fact that I believe most creatures like Dualcaster Mage are 3 mana. So this is just a 2 mana slot. I'm not sure if they would swap something or if they would just put another one of these in there. I'm not sure. But it is very interesting to see this one. Next up, Salundi Vision. This has some very trippy looking artwork, but I love it. 2 generic and a blue for an instant. Look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal an instant or sorcery from among them and put it into your hand. Then put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So this is basically 3 mana, look at the top 6. It's kind of a bad tutor for an instant or sorcery, but if you're in an instant or sorcery matters deck, you should be able to hit something, theoretically. Variance is a thing. But this is also another card that has one of those flip capabilities where it turns into Salundi Isle. It's a land that enters the battlefield tapped and taps for a blue. Odd that I chose a bunch of other certain colors for the flip cards because I didn't really like any of the cards that they had in white that flipped, personally. Alright, next up. Thieving Skydiver. This is one that a lot of people have been talking about. 1 generic and a blue for a 2/1 merfolk rogue with kicker X. X cannot be 0. Has flying. When Thieving Skydiver enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, gain control of target artifact with CMC X or less. If that artifact is an equipment, attach it to Thieving Skydiver. So, if you play this for 3 mana, you can take somebody's Soul Ring, somebody's Mana Crypt, Mox Opal, Chrome Mox, and you get a 2/1 flying body. Now, because remember, so Mox Opal and Chrome Mox each cost 0, but remember X cannot be 0, so you're paying at least 3 mana to steal those artifacts. But 3 mana to get somebody's Mana Crypt, that's like having a second Soul Ring. Why not? Especially if you're bouncing this or using this in like Yuriko the Tiger Shadow because it is a cheap flyer. And Yuriko likes the evasion. So, yeah. Thieving Skydiver is going to be seeing play quite a bit. Next up. Feed the Swarm. 1 generic and a black for a sorcery. This is a common card, but there's a lot of buzz about this. Destroy target creature or enchantment an opponent controls. Something that black has not been able to do is straight up destroy enchantments. The only colors that really have straight enchantment removal are white and green. Red has a hard time doing it. Black has a hard time doing it. Blue has a hard time doing it unless it just bounces a non-land permanent. But all the other colors have troubles with destroying enchantments. Black now has a card that gets to do this. And it can also destroy a creature. However, the downside of it is you lose life equal to that permanent's converted mana cost. But is that really a downside? We run Swords to Plowshares, we run Path to Exile that gives your opponents life or lands. Why not run this that will get rid of a permanent that you need to get rid of that makes you lose some life? This is a good card, and the fact that it's a common, I hope we're getting more of these. Next up, Nighthawk Scavenger. 1 generic and 2 black for a 1+ star 3. So he starts off as a 1/3. Flying, Death Touch, Lifelink. He's a vampire rogue. Nighthawk Scavenger's power is equal to 1 plus the power of card types among cards in your opponent's graveyards. If this sounds familiar, it's a weird version of Tarmogoyf mixed with Vampire Nighthawk. Now, except this one cares about cards in your opponent's graveyards. But think about it. How, after a while in the game, even if you're late game, your opponents are using all kinds of instant sorceries. Creatures might have hit the graveyard, artifacts might have hit the graveyard, enchantments could have hit the graveyard, fetch lands are in there, planeswalkers could have been destroyed. Late game, this could be beefy. Now, early game, he can easily be a 2/3. Think of the early games of Magic. Some instants, some sorceries may have happened. You know, people are tutoring early. People are using land-based ramp cards like rampant growth. Fetch lands could have hit the graveyard. These are early turns that stuff happens, and your Nighthawk is already getting +2, +3. You know, so he could be a starting even early game. He could start off at a 3/3 or a 4/3. That's pretty good. So I wouldn't sleep on this. This is actually not a bad idea, especially with the flying lifelink and death touch for 3 mana. Granted, he doesn't do anything immediately. He doesn't have an ETB effect or anything like that. He's just a pretty decent flying blocker, whatever you need him to be. Next up, Scourge of the Skyclaves. 1 generic and a black for a star creature demon. He also has Kicker for 4 and a black. So for the Kicker cost, he's 5 and 2 black. 7 mana. Now, when you cast this spell, if it was kicked, each player loses half their life rounded up. Pretty straightforward. Now, second line of text. Scourge of the Skyclave's power and toughness are each equal to 20 minus the highest life total among players. Now, I had to look at this a couple of times and heard about a ruling that was made about this card and immediately found out how good this card can be. Nathroi, Apex of Death, has a mutate ability that lets you bring back creatures whose total power is 10 or less. Now, let me paint you a scenario. Now, this demon's power and toughness are each equal to 20 minus the highest life total. So if somebody's at 40, his power and toughness is -20. that's important. I don't think before that there's ever been a creature or any kind of corner case where a creature has been able to be negative. He can be because of his ability, which is odd. Now, unless they come out with unless they errata it, he is the first corner case in Magic's history that has negative power and toughness. So, very specific case here. Let's say you're playing the Throi Apex of Death. Somebody's at 40 life. You do not pay the kicker cost. You want him to be at negative 20. Because Throi brings creatures out of your graveyard whose total power and toughness, or whose total power is 10 or less. Now, his power is negative 20. Which means you can dig out of your graveyard 30 power worth of creatures. That is insane. This card, now granted, don't get me wrong, this is magical Christmas land we're talking about here. So unless you're running a life gain to Throi Apex of Death style deck that mills itself in its process, and then you mutate Throi and bring him back and just spew out a bunch of creatures. Now, is this impossible? No. Because he's in the same... Throi is the same colors as Carador Ghost Chieftain. So, yeah. Throi can bring back a buttload of creatures if you have this weird creature reanimator, graveyard recursion, life gain thing going on. It's a very weird corner case. I'm not sure if there's a lot of people that are going to be utilizing this, but I thought it was interesting when I first saw it. Next up, Leyline Tyrant. 2 generic and 2 red for a 4/4 flying dragon. Boy, we're starting to get cheap on dragons. This is a scary feeling. You do not lose unspent red mana as steps and phases end. So Braid of Fire is now very, very good. When Leyline Tyrant dies, you may pay any amount of red. When you do, it deals that much damage to any target. This actually seems pretty good. If you are building a mono red deck or any kind of burn deck that can utilize extra red mana throughout steps and phases, like I said, a corner case was Braid of Fire, which gives you red mana during your upkeep. Its cumulative upkeep gives you a red. So, gives you 1, and then 2, and then 3. But now this is only as steps and phases end. It doesn't say about until as turns end. So I think when your turn ends, then the mana dissipates. So that one might need to look up just to double check. But I'm pretty sure it's just talking about during that turn. But still a very interesting card. Next up, Nahiris Lithoforming. X and 2 red for a sorcery. Sacrifice X lands. For each land sacrificed this way, draw a card. You may play X additional lands this turn. Lands you control enter the battlefield tapped this turn. So if you have like a Crucible of Worlds or a Ramunap Excavator, of course, you can play those lands that you sacrifice right out of the graveyard. Draw a ton of cards. And yeah, this is actually pretty interesting. It's kind of like a weird scape shift in a way. So I kind of like it. I feel like Lands Matter decks are definitely going to try to utilize this. I'm probably going to get a copy of it for my Lord Windgrace deck. Definitely. But yeah, definitely a good, interesting card. Next up, speaking of interesting, Relic Robber. 2 generic and a red for a 2/2 goblin rogue. He has haste. Whenever he deals combat damage to a player, that player creates a 0/1 colorless goblin construct artifact creature token. That's a mouthful. With this creature cannot attack, and at the beginning of your end step, this creature deals 1 damage to you. So if you find a way to drop this thing in, give it double strike, and hit an opponent, this will trigger twice. And you give them 2 0/1s, and then at the end of their turn, they take a point of damage for each one. Now, they're 0/1s. Don't give it to the aristocrats deck. Don't give it to somebody with a sack outlet, because they're just going to sacrifice it. However, you give it to somebody, and now they're being pinged a bunch of times with all these creatures. And they're going to, if they don't have a sack outlet, their only recourse is to try to swing at somebody and be like, will you block and kill it? And try to make deals. But if nobody makes that deal, they're swinging with a 0/1 that's doing nothing except hurting them. Because you're not going to block the 0/1, you're just, because it doesn't do any damage to you. I like the concept of this. It's very interesting. I just think that the whole aspect of, I'm going to give you a bunch of tokens, no sack outlet, oh well. It kind of seems mean, but it's kind of interesting when you're just giving opponents tokens. Especially tokens that are just hurting them in the process. I feel like I need to make a whole deck around that. I'm going to look into that. That's going to be interesting. It might run Varchild. Alright, next up we have Roiling Vortex. 1 generic and a red for an enchantment. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, Roiling Vortex deals 1 damage to them. Now, that's each player's upkeep. That includes you. So everybody's turn, they take 1 point of damage. It has an activated ability for a red. Your opponents can't gain life this turn. Pretty decent. Typical red spell. However, whenever a player casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast that spell, Roiling Vortex deals 5 damage to that player. This is Commander. This is the format where we like to cast spells for free. How many times have you seen somebody cast spells for free? Or, better yet, think of Bolus's Citadel, where they pay life instead of mana to cast it. Or any spell that they use life as a resource. You know, any Force of Negation, Force of Will, the new cycle from the Commander set that lets you cast them for free if they have their Commander on the table. There's a lot of opportunity to use this. So, this can potentially do some work. I'm not 100% sure, but I feel like CEDH players might be taking advantage of this. I would have to double check with a few people that I know. Okay. Next up, we have Valiku Awakening. 2 generic and a red for an instant. Put any number of cards from your hand on the bottom of your library. Then draw that many cards plus 1. So, in a way, this is a wheel of sorts. It's not a full-blown Wheel of Fortune. You have to already have cards in hand, and it draws you that many plus 1, so it does replace itself. I like it. It's a weird effect. We've seen effects like this before. Heartwarming Redemption comes to mind. But the cool thing about this one is it also has that flip where it turns into Valakut Stoneforge, where it turns into a land that enters the battlefield tapped and taps for a red. So, again, this is just kind of useful. It's good utility, multi-purpose. I like it a lot, actually. But moving on to the next one, Ancient Green Warden. Wow. 4 generic and 2 green for a 5/7 creature elemental with reach. You may play lands from your graveyard. That's very important because Crucible of Worlds and Ramunap Excavator are already cards that let you play lands from your graveyard. If a land entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So this is a Panharmonicon for landfall triggers. I mean, seems pretty good to me. Landfall decks are going to love this every step of the way. Never mind that it costs 6 mana because they're landfall decks. They're going to have the mana. Next up, Inscription of Abundance. 1 generic and a green for an instant. Here's a new inscription. Has kicker for 2 and a green. So with the kicker cost, it is 3 generic and 2 green. So 5 mana. And it's an instant. So you choose 1, or if you kicked it, you choose any number instead. Put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature. Target player gains X life, where X is the greatest power among creatures they control. And target creature you control fights target creature you don't control. So, if you pay the kicker cost at instant speed, you can give one of your creatures 2 +1/+1 counters, then gain that amount of life, and then have it fight one of your opponent's creatures. That seems way more useful than the other inscription. I'm just saying. Especially for 5 mana and an instant speed. Will it see a whole lot of play? I'm not entirely sure. Definitely in more casual tables, I feel, would use these, but, you know. Alright, next up. Brief mention, they reprinted Lotus Cobra. 1 generic and a green for a 2/1 has Snake, has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield, add 1 mana of any color. If you're in a landfall deck, get this card because it goes in it. Because your mana will go insane. Next up, Oren, Reef, Ooze. 2 generic and a green for a 2/2 creature ooze. When it enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. When Oren Reef attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on each attacking creature with a +1/+1 counter on it. So basically any deck that deals with a lot of +1/+1 counters, this probably should go in it. Plus it's an ooze, so if you have a ooze tribal commander deck by any chance, then you got another ooze to run with. I thought it was pretty interesting. I'm not 100% sure how many decks would actually use this, unless it's a token strategy with a +1/+1 counter theme. I'm not sure. But next one we have Roiling Regrowth. 2 generic and a green. For an instant, sacrifice a land, search your library for up to 2 basic lands, put them onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. This is a slightly worse but slightly better Harrow? No, it's not. It's slightly worse Harrow. You sacrifice a land, you get 2 lands into play tapped. 3 mana at instant speed. Harrow does the same thing, except it doesn't put them into play tapped. But for lands matters, why not? This is going to be a pretty good card for those decks, probably. Next up, Scoot Swarm, the card that is really wrecking Standard right now, but in Commander we do other more broken things. 2 generic and a green for a 1/1 creature insect with landfall. When a land enters the battlefield under your control, create a 1/1 green insect creature token. If you control 6 or more lands, create a token that's a copy of Scoot Swarm instead. That could get busted, because if you have 6 lands, you play a land, you get a copy of Scoot Swarm. And then you play another land. Now you get 2 more Scoot Swarms. This can get a little crazy. That's why I like it so much. Alright, next up. We're almost at the end. Forsaken Monument. 5 generic for a legendary artifact. Colorless creatures you control get +2/+2. That just, yep. Thopters and servos, hello. Whenever you tap a permanent for diamond mana, add an additional diamond mana. So, colorless decks that run wastes now have a mana doubler. Also, Soul Ring taps for 4. Basalt Monolith taps for 6. Grim Monolith is tapping for 8. Yeah, it's doubling up. So yeah, I believe that's how that works. Now an additional diamond. So yeah, whenever you cast a colorless spell, you gain 2 life. That part I'm not too thrilled about. It's not the best, but I do like the Anthem effect, so servos and thopters and artifact creatures get a bunch of power and toughness added, and some mana doubler for diamond mana. Why not? Lithoform Engine. 4 generic for a legendary artifact. Alright. There's a couple of abilities on this. So, 2 mana, tap it, copy target activated or triggered ability you control. You can choose new targets for the copy. Okay. 3 generic and tap it. Copy target instant or sorcery spell you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. So the first part is Strionic Resonator. The second part is a fork. 4 generic and tap it. Copy target permanent spell you control. The copy becomes a token. Now, it doesn't trigger ETBs because it says the copy becomes a token. It doesn't create a token. So that's important to note. However, if you have Lithoform Engine with the Scavenging Nighthawk, you can just put another token on the battlefield of him. Why not? So yeah, this reads very interesting, and it's copy target permanent you control. So you could copy lands and get an additional. Well, it doesn't enter, so that's weird. Otherwise, I would say that would trigger landfall, but I don't think it does. So yeah. You can copy lands, you can copy creatures, any permanent you control. This definitely seems pretty interesting. There's been a lot of talk about this one. I'm not sure if there's a way to go infinite with it. But the fact that you have that much utility on one artifact, a lot of decks can utilize that card on a lot of different levels, which is really cool that it has that much versatility. Because is it a ubiquitous card? Does it go in every single commander deck? A lot of commander decks run instants of sorceries. A lot of commander decks have triggered and activated abilities. A lot of commander decks want a copy of their permanents. It could potentially actually go in a lot of decks, if not all. Am I saying that that's an open and shut case? Probably not. There are some decks that are probably just more efficient and wouldn't run something like that because it's not 100% there as full efficient. So I don't think it goes in every single commander deck. However, does it go in a lot of them? Absolutely. It's actually a really good card all the way around because of the amount of versatility that you have. So I don't see a reason why a lot of different commander decks wouldn't run it. However, not every single commander deck would. But that's the end of the list. Now, if you're looking through Scryfall, yes, I skipped over a couple of rares and mythics because I personally didn't. I wanted to just pick out the ones that I felt were going to be more useful in Commander. The others I didn't feel were that big of a deal. If I'm wrong, please let me know down in the comments below. Let me know if you feel like I missed a card that should have been talked about. Is there anything from the new set that you're really excited about? Or are you excited that Landfall's back? I know I am. And my Windgrace deck is. But with that coming to a close, I'm going to go ahead and leave it up to you guys. Let me talk about it down in the comments, and I will see you guys next video.